Hello and welcome to the Online Diversity Summit. I'm your host Vijay Hari. I have with me Puja Kohli. Puja Kohli is the founder director of Unfold Consulting. Unfold Consulting is an organization that works in building winning cultures and are a thought leader in generational diversity. Welcome to the summit, Puja. Pleasure having you here with us.
Thank you, Vijay, and a pleasure being part of this novel summit, an online summit. I think this is my first, and I'm sure the first of many others. So thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be part of this platform and format today. Yeah.
We are going to be discussing on the interesting topic, and I believe one and only topic of this summit, managing generations at work. So, Pooja, how did you get started on this journey on generational diversity?
So let me begin with something personal because this topic is, while at one angle it's professional, it actually started very personally. When I look back to my own childhood, I was actually born in a joint family. So I grew up in a joint family, and I had the fortune of actually living with my great grandmother, grandparents, multiple uncles and aunts together. So very unconsciously, generational, work with living in a household with multiple generations and being able to empathize with them was pretty much part of my DNA. And it was really wonderful as growing up years to be able to be influenced by so many thoughts and perspectives. And when you're a child, it's really not about generations; it's about the people around you. But a lot of their thoughts have sort of influenced me around the way. And when I sort of meandered in my adult life into the professional aspect of generational diversity is when I sort of started reflecting in terms of how my journey has started. So it goes a long way back, and I think very subconsciously having embedded this was something which just expressed itself a couple of years back when I was actually looking at organization and cultures.
Yeah, lovely. So, Pooja, what exactly is generational diversity? So, we have seen Gen X, Gen Y, Millennials. What is generational diversity and how do organizations get impacted?
Well, I think when we think of generations, very simply, and if you sort of really see the way we've evolved, earlier on, the generation gap was considered to be 20 years, then moved to 10 years, and over the last couple of decades, it's almost like 5 years. So, unlike gender, where there's a very physical visibility of who a man and a woman is, generations today is a very invisible form of diversity. While age we look at as visible, but if you really look at workplaces today and with the 5 year generation gap, people will look pretty much the same. But what is the invisible quality of generational diversity which really impacts organizations is our attitudes, it's our beliefs, it's our thought processes, it's our values, it's about the time and period that we've been born, what have been the influences during that point, and how does it start impacting. So while generational diversity was very stark about a couple of decades back, today it's become fairly, invisible. And working with these invisible factors is what is the imperative for most organizations. I've had very amusing experiences when a 28-year-old actually considers a 22-year-old of a different generation. And when we think of generation, we obviously think of people much older to us compared, we compare ourselves with people who are significantly older to us. But here we are almost like today, almost looking at 5 year gaps. So, and that is really the reality that organizations have to work with huge, and when we really look at India today, we consider India to be a workforce which is a country which is almost 50%, younger to the age of 25, 30. And when people ask me why has generational diversity today become so important, it's not that we were not young and we didn't grow up. So why now? I think it's because of the number of the youth have been a significant influencer today and entering workforce in large numbers. has impacted this and awakened this as an area to also work with for organizations. Because you do have a younger workforce being managed by a middle-aged group and being led by a much older group. And then you sort of start realizing that how do you deal with these three types of value systems, three worldviews, how do you collaborate and how do you work with each other. And that's really the basis of why it's important for organizations.
Lovely. So, you've been working with a lot of organizations. Have you seen any difference in the generational cohorts between India and the Western countries?
Yes, so in the US, and we go back to the US for a lot of this literature around diversity, we talk about pretty much about three generations. We talk about baby boomers, we talk about Gen X, and of course, we talk about the millennials. Their work history has, the way they're, from the time that of the world wars to now, there's been a certain evolution. When we look at India, pretty much our work history begins from 1950s, starts getting much more formal from the 1960s, and we have in that period we have almost we're talking about 4 to 5 generations. There is of course a generation which is no longer working, but today we have 4 generations. We also look at millennials, where typically it's the millennial generation across the world is pretty much living in the same time. So a Netflix movie which gets released pretty much at the same time across. So the influences are the same. But within workforce, we are today dealing with nearly about 4 generations, whereas it's a lot more flatter, in the more evolved economies. Only because India has seen a radical change over the last couple of decades, from the post-liberalization and opening up of the economy, the kind of impact technology has had, and that is where we are a lot more diverse and generationally divided compared to,
Right. So, would it be right to still go ahead and use Gen X, Gen Y terminologies in India as well?
Yes, it there is, but I think the context of a Gen Xer in India would be a little different. And we while there are so many theories and there are so many definitions around generations, I sort of simplify it and say that let's look at generations who were born in the 60s, right? What defines them? Let's look at a generation born in the 70s, right, and the 80s and 90s, and now between 90 and 2000. Actually, you can't even look at 10 years. As I said, you have to actually look at 5 years. So let's really look at the period rather than giving all these terminologies. Because when you start getting terminologies, then what are the overlaps, what are the differences. But if we start looking at periods, then we start looking at what was the context of that period, right? So what defines a person who was probably born between 1961 to 68, 69? What defined their context? What was the history of the country at that time? What was the political, economic scenario there? What shaped their value systems? Those who were born in the 70s actually grew up in the 80s and 90s and experienced, the whole post-liberalization, experienced privatization, right? So, how are they different today? What is their thinking process? Right, and so on and so forth. So I think more than the terminology, I think if we start looking at the period in which people were born, that sort of simplifies it and contextualizes it. Otherwise, we are keeping on. We keep debating about this Gen X, Gen Y, millennial, what the West, India. But I think it's all about the period and the context and what shaped the individual, during the time that he or she was born.
Lovely. So, you've done a lot of research on generational diversity. So, what was your basis of the research, and if you can share the insights?
Honestly, I stumbled upon generational diversity. I didn't really start off reflecting. I was doing a culture audit, before I embarked on my previous organization. And during the culture assessment, I started realizing that there were a whole lot of value systems, like the value of respect was getting defined in various ways. And the organization was a fairly tenured experienced one. They were hiring a lot of younger people. So over a period of time with a blended workplace, there were a whole lot of cultural dimensions that seemed to be differing between age groups. And that's when I started exploring the space and I realized that there is a generation impact to even looking at values today, right? A simple values respect. How a person in the 60s, born and brought up in 60s and 70s, and those in the 80s and 90s would really define it. And that led to sort of really profiling it a case study, and there was NASCOM sort of released that paper, really caught my imagination. And as I said, it was also a reflection back from my childhood days, and went into sort of doing a fairly large industry study, looking at the multi-generational view of the millennials. The study received almost like about 8,000 responses. It was focused for the IT and ITS industry, as NASCOM was one of the sponsors. And the hypothesis there was looking at the fact that already shifts have started taking place at home. The parental and child relationships have changed. Today, the parenting styles and the way they bring up their kids and what they get challenged by is very different from how we were brought up. And it was that hypothesis which sort of led to looking at then what is their worldview, what are the values, how are the different generations different from each other. The study, I have sort of kept it very alive because from the millennials, I started looking at the senior cohorts, looking at the fact that what happens to people post-retirement. I mean, in India, we talk a lot about younger people, of course, because millennials and the youth sort of drive all the conversations, but we forget that India is an aging country, right? While we don't talk about the aging aspect, but it is becoming a reality. There are studies which says that there will be almost 20% of the workforce, which would be sort of aging in the next 15, 20 years. And I started looking at studying retirees, early retirees, 58 to 62. Again, very different patterns in terms of their thinking process. They weren't looking at just opening a newspaper and reading stories to their grandchildren. They were really looking at how could they redefine and recast their lives for the next 10, 15 years, because they are productive, they have with better medical facilities today, if you look at our own families as well, retirement doesn't really mean, old age. It's a new beginning of sort. And very recently we replenished the study for, students from the age group of 17, and I looked at up to 20 to 23 younger entrants into the workplace. So we are fairly research-based, and because I like looking at patterns, ultimately when we look at generations, it's also a phenomenon. And each of these studies has given us a lot of insights into really looking at the fact that how do different cohorts think differently and how do you need to work with them. Let me give you a few examples. So for instance, a value of loyalty. Our generation really defines it, or the older generation, more in terms of, being loyal to a certain system, to an organization, spending time. Loyalty today has really changed to loyalty to self. It's about commitment to oneself, to one's own progress, to one's own growth, to one's own, engagement. Not so much loyalty to a system or an organization, right? When we, all of us have had friends, and, for us, friendships has been that, beyond work, we have a couple of friends that we detox with. But the concept of friendships have changed today. I came across a very interesting incident where, somebody said that I applied for an IJP only because the manager of the next team was a friend of mine. And not really that, I'm moving because I really need to move to another team. But the driver was that, this whole spirit of friendship, the spirit of working informally is a big driver for the younger generation. So what this has led to is to really looking at formal structures within organization. How can you open up spaces for people to express themselves, right? And there are some people, of course, the older generations would prefer formality, but the younger generations would prefer informality. So how do you bridge this difference? How do you bridge this gap? So there are multiple incidents like that. I mean, the other day in my workplace as well, I have, it's multi-generational in a way, and I walk in and then I see a couple of younger interns all with their headphones on, right? And they were focusing and they were listening to music. And after a point of time, I said, "Are you going to get distracted?" They were like, "No, silence distracts us. But when we listen to music, we can really be very productive." All these are points of reflection because personally, I can't listen to music while doing a serious piece of work or preparing a deck, but they can. So when you start observing these nuances, you start seeing, really these could be small differences, but over a period of time, that's the orientation towards work, towards building relationships, towards looking at factors like loyalty, commitment, and then how do you work with this phenomena? Can you today broad brush and have interventions that are very similar, or do you need to segment your interventions? Because there would, if you are looking at gender, if you are being cognizant the fact that different generations think differently, then how do you bring your HR programs and practices, your learning models, your career approaches, your work formats? How do you segment it? Keeping that group so that you can engage and retain.
Very, very interesting, Pooja. So, have you noticed any trends among different industries? Does the generation gap vary, let's say, from an automotive industry to an IT, or is there any trend that you have observed?
Yes. So, of course, the technology industry being a very people-based industry, and I know much more newer industry, and you have other services industries like retail, etc., where the workforces have got tremendously juniorized. And of course, so you have a large, I came across that you could have nearly between 60 to 80% of your workforce actually being in their 20s and early 30s. While in engineering, manufacturing, organizations, while of course there is an intake of youth, but the percentages would not be that high, right? But the fact is that this phenomena is not just industry specific, while the amplification may be depending on the numbers, but it is, today sort of resonating with a lot of, we worked with a traditional bank, let me give you an example there as well. A traditional bank, global bank, and of course, as you know, banks are very formal in their demeanor, right? A person in a bank will be suited and all of that, and there's a dress code. This piece of work was actually commissioned directly with the CEO because one of the struggles that they were getting, they were also hiring, of course, the talent pool today is going to be younger, so they were hiring younger folks. And they were getting challenged with a simple thing that somebody, while wanting to take leave, has sent a WhatsApp message saying that I'm going on leave. And they were sort of challenged by looking at what kind of communication protocols, because there was a lot of informality in the way communication needs were being looked at. And the work that we did actually with the CEO and his leadership team was to really look at what would this change need to mean. If they wanted to become from a very traditional, formal organization, they wanted to become a little more looser. Of course, they couldn't become 360-degree like what maybe a technology company can become, but they still wanted to, move a few steps to see which are the areas that they could become a lot less formal than they were today. So it is a phenomena which in different magnitudes is impacting depending on the influx and the talent.
Interesting. So, from your experience, have you faced any big challenge that an organization has faced while dealing with multiple generations?
A lot of it comes back to how do you manage communication and conflict. I think the whole area is pretty much there. That how do you build a constructive dialogue? Uh, Today, when we are saying that we have to become agile, we have to become collaborative workplaces, right? By the way, generational diversity is actually a form of cognitive diversity. Organizations are also talking about the need for innovation, and innovation not just being for the innovation function, but everybody needs to become innovative in their mindset. So if you have to become innovative, you have to be very open to different perspectives. And perspective diversity, generational diversity really goes together because when you are open to looking at people with different thought processes, different age groups, you're then making the work place that much more richer. I have a concern for organizations which are really tilting towards one generation, because then you're sort of really missing out the potential of others. In India, while we continue talking about the youth, I think there's a huge value in wisdom and silver hairs. And Unfold Second Innings, a program that we launched, and I've been nurturing it for the last 2 years, has been to really look at that. Do you want to lose the potential of this wisdom and experience? Because if you tilt your workforce significantly to one generational group, then you're again excluding the possibilities of ideas, the possibilities of thinking that comes when we are working with challenges. And so I think the to your point, what I sort of see is organizations who have really sort of tilted towards one generation end up facing a different set of problems. And the ones who aren't able to acknowledge multi-generation end up living with issues of, communication and conflict. And so when we sort of work with organizations, we try and see how can you really build a more holistic fabric, and to be open. And again, India is a very complex country. So when we talk about even generations, even if we sort of talk about millennials, we have one view of millennials that have grown up in urban India, right? We have a similar generation that's growing up in small towns and villages. So along with generation, how do you invite cultural and regional diversity? Because you could have peer groups of the same generation actually thinking a little differently based on which part of the country they have grown in, right? So that's the next level of complexity. It's not, again, also we can't broad brush that everybody born in the same age group, if they're born in Bangalore versus if they're born in, Coimbatore or a different location, which is a much more smaller location, you could still see differences. So when you look at this space, you have to also look at all the nuances that it comes with. And then working with cultural and regional and generational together sort of starts, adding a lot of value to the dialogue that organizes.
Lovely. What practices have worked towards building a healthy ecosystem for managing generational diversities, Puja?
Uh, One is to, as I mentioned, was to not look at your people practices as homogeneous. You have to be nuanced by looking at what does a career mean to a 20-year-old versus what a career means to a 40-year-old. And then how do you define that for that individual? So a more segmented approach to talent management is first. Second is to have an organization which is very open to feedback, right? If we look at providing reverse feedback, so it's not really about, uh, you know, having a bunch of people just try to navigate themselves, right? But it's to really look at that, can an older person learn from a younger person and vice versa, right? So how does that impact your mentoring? If we think differently, how do we come to the same platform? How do we build a lot more empathy? Uh, this space is, if we don't talk about empathy, because it's all about, do I empathize from where you're coming from? Uh, can I put myself into your shoes? Because when we look at a lot of unconscious biases in this space, we come across a lot of ways to say that, the older generation is inflexible, right? And the stereotype that the older generation holds for the youth is that they're very impatient. And when we sort of start looking at all these unconscious biases, is to look at how do you deconstruct this and how do you sort of work through this rather than living with these stereotypes. And that's really the effort that organizations have to put in. That how do you build that mindset, build empathy, segment your talent practices so that you can have something which retains and engages people of different generations, and you don't just tilt the dialogue to one cohort only, but you really look at the power of a multi-generational workplace. right? Because that's the huge potential that we have. And it's not to exclude viewpoints, but to sort of include perspectives.
Pooja, what are some of the checklists or tools that organizations, leaders can refer while starting off this journey? So I understand some things like how they even set up their cubicles, how they design their workplaces, right?
Right.
Like the informality that you were talking about, right? The feedbacks to be given. So what are some of the lists that people have to look into it?
Yeah, so I think space design, but space design is also tough for organizations who already have their spaces designed. So that's a heavy investment, in terms of how do you look at your space, because that, of course, is a critical one, but maybe difficult to keep changing one's, space design if you're already constructed. But then within that, how do you build spaces? I think that's more important, right? One is physical space, right? The other one is mental spaces. And spaces of open dialogue, of open communication, of being able to respect each other from where you're coming. And this requires sensitization because, while I've been steeped in a lot of research, so my obviously lens comes by acquiring a lot of my perspectives. But for a lot of people, this is not intuitive. And what tends to happen is barriers get formed, right? Barriers of stereotypes. So how do you work with unconscious biases? And from a leadership perspective, it's very important to recognize that a leader is a culture catalyst, right? And if you want to build an environment, there is no magic bullet. So how do you invest and be a role model to look at how can I be, am I approachable? So there's another very amusing incident. Like there was an organization that I was working with, and the MD told me one day that he was surprised, and he was sitting in his office, and it's a closed door office, and he got a knock on the door, and he was just about to prepare for a con call, so he was surprised that why is his EA knocking at the door? So he asked to come in, and instead of the EA, walks in a young fresher, right? Who says, "Hi, I am so and so, and I've just joined this organization as of today. I was crossing your door, and I thought I realized that you're the managing director of this company, and I came to say hello." So he was so taken aback, right? Because he didn't expect that somebody would just come walking in. So how do we build that? As I said, there's one on infrastructure, but you can still work with that same infrastructure and build an open workplace, right? And be approachable, irrespective of age, authority, title, etc. Secondly, is to really work with the unconscious biases that exist at the team level, because these are hidden, and and these are micro inequities that could happen for various reasons, because we come with our attitudes and beliefs. So how can you sensitize teams and managers to be able to break these mental models and build a more collaborative workplace? And the third, as I mentioned, is how do we not broad brush initiatives, keeping that everybody is the same, but becoming a lot more generational sensitive and looking at our talent practices, that what would work for one generation may not work for the other. But if I do have 3 to 4 generations in my workplace and I want to retain all of them, then how do I work with my people practices to sort of engage with each of them differently? So these are the 3 or 4. It's a very large, complex space, and a lot gets unearthed when we work with organizations like any element of DNI. But these are quick 3 things that organizations should invest their time and effort.
Lovely. I think that is a beautiful summary of all the things that organizations have to note and work consciously to get all the generations to work together. So beautifully said, Pooja. Lovely. Where can our delegates reach out to you if they want to reach you further to understand more on generational diversity?
My email ID is Puja, Puja, at unfold-consulting.com. My number is 9866233767, and happy to speak to them, have a conversation, address through an email, etc. as it works. And the website is unfold-consulting.com, so anybody can reach us anytime.
Lovely. Such a pleasure talking to you, Pooja. Thank you so much for sparing your time.
Thank you, Vijay. I think this was very novel and very interesting. In fact, when I got the mail, I thought twice. I was like, I must explore because today, being part of a city with so much hustle bustle, that more things that can be done virtually from your home or office is a very brilliant way to reach out. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and I wish you all the best. I'm looking forward to the conference and hearing all the other speakers as well.
Definitely, Pooja. It's really been enriching having you here.
Thank you, Vijay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.